The sheriff slammed my son's hands against the hood and smiled when the plastic bag fell from the jacket pocket. My son stared at him in disbelief. "That isn't mine." The sheriff didn't answer. He simply looked toward his deputies and said, "Book him." Rainwater ran down my son's face, mixing with tears he was desperately trying not to shed. His truck sat 30 feet away with the driver's door open, its interior light glowing in the darkness. I watched the scene through a hotel window across the street, listening to the recorded call playing through my phone. My son's voice came through the speaker again. "Dad, I swear I didn't have drugs." Then the recording ended. I had arrived in town 23 minutes earlier. I had spent most of my adult life operating in places where deception wasn't an accident, it was a weapon. I knew what staged evidence looked like, I knew what fear looked like, and I knew when someone was trying to make a young man believe the entire world had turned against him. My son had made mistakes in his life, like every young man does, but he wasn't a drug dealer, he wasn't violent. He wasn't stupid enough to carry illegal drugs in a jacket that still had his college parking pass attached to it. The sheriff knew that too. That was what bothered me. He wasn't trying to arrest my son. He was trying to build a story around him. I left the hotel and walked toward the station without rushing. My military past was not something I advertised. I had spent years in Delta Force, learned to operate without recognition, and eventually left because I wanted my family to know me as a father rather than a shadow moving through dangerous places. My son knew I had served. He didn't know everything. He didn't know the names of the men who had trusted me with their lives. He didn't know how many times I had walked into rooms where everyone else was lying. He didn't know that I could look at a photograph of a crime scene and notice what wasn't there. When I entered the sheriff's office, Deputy Keller looked up and said, "Visiting hours are over." I told him I was there for my son. He asked my name. I gave it. His expression changed. Just slightly. It was enough. He knew who I was, but there was something else in his face. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear that someone had warned him I was coming. I asked to see the evidence bag. Keller said I couldn't. I asked who collected it. He said the sheriff. I asked where it had been found. He said inside my son's jacket. Then I asked the question that made the room go silent. Why is there no photograph of it being found? Keller didn't answer. The sheriff appeared behind the glass office door. He stared at me for several seconds before saying, "You're going to want to let this one go." I smiled. "I'm his father." The sheriff's smile disappeared. "Exactly," he said. "That's why I'm giving you a chance to walk away." He didn't know it yet, but he had just told me everything I needed to know. My son was released on a temporary hold after his attorney arrived, but the damage had already been done. The sheriff's department had issued a statement describing him as the subject of a narcotics investigation. His photograph was circulating online before we even reached the courthouse. By midnight, strangers were calling him a criminal. My son sat across from me in the kitchen of my house, elbows on the table, staring at his hands. He looked exhausted. "Dad, I don't understand." I told him that was normal. People who are framed often spend the first hours trying to understand why someone would do something so irrational. The answer usually isn't rational. It's personal, financial, or protective. I asked him about the hours before his arrest. He told me he had driven home from work, stopped at a gas station, and parked outside a diner. He had been there for 14 minutes. Then a deputy pulled him over. The deputy claimed my son had been driving erratically. My son insisted he hadn't. I asked whether the deputy searched the truck. He said yes. I asked whether he had signed consent. No. I asked whether the deputy showed him a warrant. No. I asked whether another officer arrived before the search. Yes. That officer was Sheriff Mercer himself. I wrote the timeline down. Traffic stop, search, sheriff arrival, discovery, arrest, press statement, 5 events, 1 problem. The sheriff's report said Mercer had arrived after the drugs were discovered. My son said Mercer was there before. I asked whether anyone else had seen the stop. He remembered a waitress from the diner standing outside. Her name was Elena. We found her the next morning. She remembered the sheriff's SUV arriving before the deputy opened my son's truck. She had also seen Mercer remove something from his own vehicle. She couldn't identify what it was. That was enough to request surveillance footage. The diner had cameras facing the parking lot. The owner initially said the footage was unavailable. Then he called me privately and said someone from the sheriff's office had already requested it. That was the first moment I realized The conspiracy might be larger than one corrupt sheriff. Someone had anticipated evidence. Someone was cleaning the scene before we even knew what to look for. I didn't confront Mercer. I didn't threaten anyone. I hired an independent attorney and a digital forensics specialist. We began preserving everything. My son gave us his phone. We copied his location history. It placed him at the diner during the exact period when Mercer claimed he had been somewhere else. Then the forensic specialist found something unexpected. My son's phone had connected briefly to a police department Wi-Fi network while he was being processed. That wasn't unusual by itself, but the connection occurred before the evidence bag was logged. Someone had used my son's device, or a nearby system, to alter the digital timeline. The specialist looked at me and said, "This isn't sloppy." I nodded. "No." He asked what I thought it meant. I looked at the timeline. It means whoever did this expected nobody to check, and that was when my son's case stopped being a simple drug arrest and became something much darker. The next morning, I went to the courthouse. Sheriff Mercer was there with 2 attorneys. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. He approached me before the hearing and said, "You should take your son out of the county." I asked why. "Because things are going to get worse." I looked directly into his eyes. "For whom?" He didn't answer. The judge entered. The prosecution presented the evidence. The plastic bag allegedly recovered from my son's jacket contained enough narcotics to create a serious felony charge. The prosecutor described my son as a potential distributor. I watched the sheriff's deputies sitting behind him. One kept rubbing his thumb against his index finger, a nervous habit. The other wouldn't look at me. I wrote their names down. After the hearing, I asked my attorney to subpoena the body camera footage. The prosecutor objected. We pushed harder. Within 2 days, we obtained a copy. The footage was revealing. The deputy's camera showed him approaching my son's truck. Then the image froze for 11 seconds. When it resumed, Sheriff Mercer was standing beside the vehicle. The deputy's voice said, "We've got something." But there was no visible search, no moment where the evidence appeared. The prosecutor called it a technical malfunction. My attorney called it a preservation issue. I called it a missing 11 seconds. We requested the original server file. The department claimed it had been overwritten. That was impossible. The department's own retention policy required 90 days. We obtained the policy. Then we obtained a backup from a state evidence system. The missing 11 seconds were still there. Someone had deleted them from the local copy but failed to remove the state backup. When the footage was restored, we saw the sheriff reaching into the open truck before the deputy announced the discovery. The evidence wasn't found in my son's jacket. It had been placed inside the vehicle. That should have ended the case. It didn't. The prosecutor refused to dismiss the charges. Mercer insisted the footage had been misinterpreted. Then a second witness came forward. A mechanic across the street had seen Mercer remove a small plastic bag from his patrol SUV. He remembered because Mercer had dropped something near the curb and picked it up before entering my son's truck. The mechanic had never spoken to police because he didn't trust them. Now he was willing to testify. I asked why. He said, "Because they did this to my brother." That sentence changed the temperature in the room. My son wasn't the first. We started searching old cases involving drug arrests made by Mercer's department. 3 defendants had been convicted based heavily on evidence collected by the same deputy. 2 had already filed appeals. 1 was still in prison. Every case contained unusual gaps, missing footage, unlogged evidence, conflicting timestamps. I felt something inside me shift. This was no longer about saving my son. It was about exposing a system that had learned how to manufacture guilt. I called Marcus Reed, my old teammate. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You know what this means." I did. "They're going to know we're looking." He paused. "They already do." That night, my house alarm went off at 2:13 a.m. By the time I reached the hallway, the back door was open. Nothing appeared stolen. But my son's room had been searched. On his desk sat a single sheet of paper. It contained one sentence. "You served your country. Don't make us your next war." I folded the paper carefully. Then I looked at my son. He was terrified. I told him the truth. They made one mistake. He asked what it was. I said, "They thought fear would make us quiet." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I rebuilt the case from the beginning. In the military, you learn that the strongest investigation is often the one that removes assumptions. So I treated every statement as unverified. Every report became a claim rather than a fact. Every timestamp became something that needed independent confirmation. By morning, we had a second attorney involved, one specializing in civil rights litigation. She asked me a question that stayed with me. "What do you want?" I looked at my son sleeping on the couch. "His name back." She nodded. "Then we build a case that survives without you." That was exactly what I wanted. I didn't need to become the headline. My son needed his future. We filed requests for every communication involving Mercer, the deputy, the prosecutor, and the department's evidence division. The department resisted all of them. That resistance created another paper trail. Meanwhile, Marcus located an independent former investigator who had worked for the county years earlier. Her name was Dana Cole. She agreed to review the case. She found something I had missed. The evidence bag number in my son's case had been assigned 12 minutes before the traffic stop officially occurred. I stared at the document. "That's impossible," Dana nodded. "Exactly. Someone had prepared the evidence container before the alleged discovery. That meant the frame-up wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. The question became why. My son had no history that would make him valuable to a drug conspiracy, no criminal connections, no financial disputes, no known enemies. Then my son remembered something. 3 weeks earlier, he had witnessed a deputy arguing with a local contractor behind a warehouse. He had taken a photograph because he thought the argument looked suspicious. The photograph showed a sheriff's vehicle beside a truck loaded with sealed boxes. My son had never reported it because he thought it was none of his business. We recovered the photograph. The metadata placed it on a Tuesday afternoon. We enhanced the image. One of the boxes had a company logo. That company had a contract with the county. We traced the company to a warehouse owned by a man named Victor Kane. Kane had donated heavily to Mercer's campaign. More importantly, Kane's company had been accused in a civil lawsuit of falsifying inventory records. The lawsuit had disappeared after the plaintiff received a confidential settlement. We weren't proving a drug conspiracy yet, but we had found motive for protecting someone. My son's photograph could have become evidence against Kane. Framing him with drugs could discredit him before anyone asked what he had seen. That was the theory. Then the missing photograph surfaced. Someone had tried to delete it from my son's cloud account. They failed because he had shared it with a friend. The friend still had the original. The image was now duplicated in 3 locations. We had a witness. We had digital evidence. We had conflicting police reports. We had the prepared evidence bag, and we had a sheriff who had warned me to leave town before I even knew what he was afraid of. The pieces were beginning to connect. But one question remained unanswered. Who had ordered Mercer to frame my son? The answer arrived in an envelope with no return address. Inside the envelope was a photograph of Sheriff Mercer shaking hands with a state senator. The image itself wasn't remarkable. Politicians shake hands with law enforcement officials every day. But written on the back was a date from 6 years earlier. Underneath it was an account number. Our financial investigator traced the number to a consulting company. The company had received county contracts worth millions. Its registered owner was Victor Kane. That connected Mercer to Kane financially. But the account also showed payments to a private security firm run by a former federal contractor. That company employed several former law enforcement officers and had quietly taken over security for multiple county facilities. We started looking deeper. The firm's director was a man named Adrian Vale. I recognized the name immediately. Vale had once worked in a military contracting environment. We had crossed paths during an operation years earlier. He had a reputation for solving problems quietly. He wasn't a soldier like me. He was something different. He believed institutions were tools and people were assets. When I called Marcus and mentioned the name, the line went silent. "You sure?" he asked. "Yes." Marcus took a breath. "Then this isn't local." We began checking Vale's known associates. Several appeared in private security contracts across the region. One had connections to the county prosecutor. Another had donated to the sheriff's campaign. A third had provided consulting services to Kane. The network was becoming visible. But we still had to prove the connection to my son. We found it in an unexpected place. A traffic camera archive showed Vale's security vehicle near the diner on the night my son was arrested. The vehicle wasn't registered to him. It belonged to Kane's company. The driver had entered the parking lot 20 minutes before the traffic stop. He left 10 minutes after my son was arrested. We obtained the driver's identity through a subpoena. He had been paid a large amount of money the day after the arrest. The payment came from an account controlled by Mercer. Now we had something substantial, not speculation, not rumor. A financial transaction connected the sheriff to a person whose vehicle was present before the arrest. The prosecutor finally agreed to a federal referral. Federal investigators opened their own case. They interviewed my son without local police present. They listened. They examined his phone. They recovered the photograph. They examined the evidence bag. They examined the body camera footage. Then they asked me to leave the room while they questioned him privately. I did. When the interview ended, my son came outside and looked relieved. "They believed me," he said. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Good." He looked at me. "Dad, are they going to get away with it?" I answered honestly. "I don't know." Then he asked the question I had been avoiding. "What are you going to do if they do?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to make sure they don't." The federal investigation changed the balance immediately. Mercer stopped speaking publicly. The prosecutor recused himself. The department announced an internal review. But corruption doesn't disappear when investigators arrive. It adapts. One deputy suddenly resigned. Another stopped answering calls. Evidence files were moved. Computers were disconnected. The sheriff's office claimed routine maintenance. Federal agents knew better. Warrants were issued. Digital systems were preserved. My attorney warned me to stay out of direct contact with the department. I agreed. My role was now simple: protect my son and preserve evidence. One evening, a former deputy contacted us anonymously. He said Mercer had ordered officers to create problem cases against people who interfered with county contracts. Some were given warnings. Others were arrested. A few were framed with evidence. He provided copies of internal messages. One message referred to my son by name before his arrest. That proved the sheriff had known about him before the traffic stop. The former deputy also identified the person who had ordered the frame-up. It was Adrian Vale. Vale had learned about my son's photograph and decided the easiest way to discredit him was to create a narcotics case. Mercer was paid to execute it. The deputy who conducted the stop was promised protection. The evidence was prepared in advance. The press statement was drafted before the arrest. Everything had been planned. My son hadn't been caught committing a crime. He had been selected as a target. When I heard that, I felt anger rise like heat behind my ribs. Marcus noticed. "Don't let them choose the ending," he said. I nodded. The investigation continued. Federal agents obtained communications showing Vale had contacted Mercer days before the arrest. They found messages discussing the kid and the photograph. They found the prepared press release. They found financial transfers. The case against Mercer became overwhelming. Then Vale disappeared. His office was empty. His home had been cleared. His phone was off. A vehicle crossed the state line. Federal investigators issued an alert. My old instincts screamed at me to find him myself. I knew how to track people. I knew how to search places others overlooked. But I also knew that if I stepped outside the law, Vale could turn the entire case into a story about a dangerous veteran seeking revenge. So I stayed home. That decision was harder than anything I had faced in combat. My son sat beside me that night. "You could find him," he said. I didn't ask how he knew. "Maybe." He looked at me. "Then why don't you?" I answered. "Because I want him caught, not hunted." My son was quiet. Then he said, "I think I understand." The next morning, federal agents found Vale. He had been hiding under a false identity in another state. He surrendered without resistance. During questioning, he denied everything. Then investigators showed him the financial records. He asked for an attorney. That was the first crack. The second came when they showed him the original evidence bag assignment. The third came when they showed him the photograph from my son's cloud backup. Vale finally admitted knowing about the photograph. He claimed Mercer had acted independently. But investigators had the messages. The frame-up had been planned from the beginning. The final question was whether Mercer would testify against Vale. Mercer broke 3 days later. He agreed to cooperate in exchange for consideration in his sentencing. He described how the operation worked. Kane provided money. Vale identified targets. Mercer used the sheriff's department to create legal pressure. Officers manipulated traffic stops, evidence records, and reports. The goal wasn't always conviction. Sometimes it was intimidation. Sometimes people were simply pushed out of the way. My son's case was supposed to be easy. A young man, a suspicious-looking traffic stop, drugs allegedly found in his possession, a press statement before anyone could question the evidence. The only thing they hadn't anticipated was his father. Not because I was Delta Force, not because I had combat experience, because I refused to accept the first version of the story. The federal prosecutor built the case carefully. Every allegation was corroborated. Every witness was protected. Every digital record was authenticated. The public learned about the investigation months later. Headlines appeared. The sheriff resigned. Several deputies were arrested. Kane's contracts were terminated. Vale faced federal charges. The prosecutor who had tried to push the original case was investigated for misconduct. And my son? His charges were dismissed with prejudice. The court formally acknowledged that the evidence had been fabricated, but the hardest moment came afterward. My son stood outside the courthouse holding a folder containing the dismissal. He looked at it for a long time. "Does this fix it?" he asked. I told him no. "But it tells the truth." He nodded. "I wanted them to know I wasn't a criminal," I said. "Now they do." He hugged me. I hadn't realized how much he had been carrying until that moment. He had spent months wondering whether people believed him. He had watched strangers online call him names. He had seen his future disappear under accusations created by people with badges. Now he could breathe again. The case against the corrupt officers moved forward. Some pleaded guilty. Others went to trial. Mercer testified. Vale refused to cooperate. Kane attempted to negotiate. The court rejected the most favorable terms. One by one, the people who had built the conspiracy faced consequences, not through violence, not through revenge, through evidence, through witnesses, through records they thought nobody would ever examine. My son started rebuilding his life. He returned to school. He changed jobs. He stopped reading comments online. I encouraged him to see a counselor. He resisted at first. Then he agreed. Months later, he told me it had helped. I told him I was proud. He laughed. "You were proud before." Yes. Even when everyone thought I was guilty, I looked at him. Especially then, he smiled. "Thanks, Dad." That was the moment I realized something. The sheriff had tried to take my son's future. Instead, he had exposed himself and everyone around him. The frame-up had become the evidence that destroyed the entire network, but there was still one final piece. The original photograph my son had taken outside the warehouse. Investigators enlarged it and found a license plate reflected in a metal surface. That vehicle belonged to a company connected to Kane. Inside the warehouse were records of illegal transactions, falsified contracts, and payments to public officials. The photograph that had nearly destroyed my son became the photograph that brought down the operation. It was introduced as evidence in federal court. My son sat in the gallery when it happened. He didn't look at the defendants. He looked at me. I nodded. He smiled. The prosecution presented the timeline. The traffic stop, the staged evidence, the missing footage, the prepared press release, the financial transfers, the warehouse photograph, the messages, the testimony, every piece connected. The defense tried to argue that Mercer had acted alone. The evidence showed otherwise. They tried to blame Vale. The evidence showed Kane had funded the operation. They tried to claim my son was suspicious. The evidence showed he had been targeted because he had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdicts came back one after another. Guilty. 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 My son closed his eyes. I watched his shoulders lower. He had been carrying that case like a weight strapped to his back. Now some of it was finally gone. After the trial, a reporter asked me whether my military background had helped. I said, "The military taught me discipline. It taught me patience. It taught me to trust evidence. But my son didn't need a soldier that day. He needed a father who wouldn't quit." The reporter asked whether I ever wanted revenge. I told the truth. Of course. She looked surprised. I continued. Anger is human. What matters is what you do with it. I had wanted to confront Mercer. I had imagined what I might say. I had imagined making him feel the fear he had created in my son. But none of those fantasies mattered once the evidence became stronger than my anger. The law moved slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, but it moved. And when it finally moved, it took the entire network with it. My son eventually graduated. At the ceremony, he walked across the stage wearing a blue suit. I stood in the crowd with tears in my eyes. For months, I had feared the accusation would define him. It didn't. His name belonged to him again. His future belonged to him again. and the people who tried to steal it were sitting in prison cells or facing years of legal consequences. That evening, we went to dinner. He raised his glass. To starting over. I raised mine. To never letting them decide who you are. He smiled. Then he asked me something unexpected. Dad, if you hadn't been Delta Force, would you still have done all this? I thought about it. I would have tried. He nodded. Good. That was all he said. But I understood. Years later, people still ask me about that case. They ask whether I was afraid. Yes. They ask whether I was angry. Absolutely. They ask whether I considered taking matters into my own hands. More times than I want to admit. But the story they don't understand is that the most important victory wasn't seeing corrupt people punished. It was seeing my son stop looking over his shoulder. It was watching him rebuild his confidence. It was hearing him laugh again without checking whether someone was listening. The sheriff thought a badge made him untouchable. The contractor thought money could erase evidence. The deputy thought a report could rewrite reality. They were wrong. Evidence has a memory. So do victims. So do families. You can manipulate a report. You can delete a video. You can threaten a witness. But eventually, someone preserves a copy. Someone remembers a timestamp. Someone keeps a photograph. Someone refuses to accept the lie. My son became that evidence without ever intending to. He had simply taken a picture when something looked wrong. That one decision exposed a network that had operated for years. When I think about the night the sheriff planted those drugs, I remember the rain on my son's face. I remember his voice saying, "Dad, I swear I didn't do it." And I remember the promise I made. I promised him I would believe him until the truth proved otherwise. The truth did, not because I was a former Delta Force operator, not because I knew how to fight, not because I could intimidate anyone. The truth won because we documented it, we preserved it, we followed it, and we refused to let anger destroy the very case that could save him. The sheriff's career ended. The deputy went to prison. Vale faced federal prosecution. Kane lost his contracts and his fortune. Several other officers were charged. My son's record was cleared. But the most powerful moment came years later when he brought his own son to visit me. He was holding the little boy's hand. The child looked up at me and asked, "Grandpa, were you a soldier?" I smiled. "A long time ago." My son laughed. "He's heard the stories." I looked at my grandson, and then at my son. "The important thing isn't what I did then." My son nodded. "It's what you did when we needed you." I looked at him. He understood. The old uniform was gone. The old weapons were locked away. The old life belonged to history. What remained was a father who had been given one terrible choice and decided that protecting his family didn't require becoming the thing he hated. That was the victory. Not revenge. Not violence. Justice. And sometimes justice doesn't arrive with gunfire or explosions. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying a folder of evidence into a courtroom, placing the truth on a table, and watching the people who believed themselves untouchable realize that the story they created has finally turned against them. If you've stayed with me through this story, then you understand what the sheriff never did. The strongest weapon isn't always force. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's evidence. Sometimes it's refusing to let someone else's corruption turn you into a person you don't recognize. My son didn't need me to become his executioner. He needed me to become his shield, and that difference changed everything. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. What kind of story do you want next? Military revenge, psychological thriller, or emotional family justice? And here's the question I want you to debate. If you were in his shoes, knowing a corrupt sheriff had framed your son, and knowing the system had failed him, would you have trusted the courts and investigators, or would you have taken justice into your own hands? Think carefully, because anger can make revenge feel satisfying for a moment, but justice can protect people long after revenge is forgotten. Tell me what you would have done, and if this story kept you listening until the end, stay with us, because the next story may remind you that the person everyone underestimates can sometimes be the one who exposes the truth nobody wanted found. Until then, protect your family, believe the people you love when they need you most, stay patient when the truth is buried, and remember that courage isn't always about knowing how to fight. Sometimes courage is knowing when not to. Stay safe, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next story.
क्योंकि ऑलरेडी मेलों पे ना सच्ची बुरी अभी
हाँ जी।
आप जो तस्वीरें कितनी तस्वीरें बनाते हो डेली?
किसकी?
इसके लिए
किसके लिए?
ये जो स्टोरी के लिए
मैं तस्वीरें क्या करनी बना के?
तस्वीरें वाली नहीं चला रहे आप?
हैं?
तस्वीरें वाली नहीं चला रहे स्टोरी?
नहीं, मैं तो कैमरे की बना रहा हूँ, कैमरा कंटेंट। इधर आओ।
क्योंकि ऑलरेडी मेलों पे ना सच्ची वीडियो अभी
हाँ जी।
आप जो तस्वीरें कितनी तस्वीरें बनाते हो डेली?
किसकी?
इसके लिए
किसके लिए?
ये जो स्टोरी के लिए
मैं तस्वीरें क्या करनी बना के?
तस्वीरें वाली नहीं चला रहे आप?
हैं?
तस्वीरें वाली नहीं चला रहे स्टोरी?
नहीं, मैं तो कैमरे की बना रहा हूँ, कैमरा कंटेंट। इधर आओ।
कैसे